Welcome back. Today, the Supreme Court allowed an unmarried woman to abort a 24-week pregnancy subject to the report by a medical board at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Earlier, the Delhi High Court had refused to let the woman undergo abortion on the grounds that the medical termination of pregnancy rules 2021 in India do not extend the 24-week limit to unmarried women. A bench led by Justices D.Y. Chandrachud observed that the Delhi High Court took an unduly restrictive view of the provisions of the medical termination of pregnancy rules while declining the woman interim relief. The court made the following observation: abortion subject to approval by medical board, abortion only if the woman's life is not risked. Unmarried woman cannot be denied abortion, also allowing women to suffer contrary to the spirit of legislation. High Court, in fact, took an unduly restrictive view, as I said earlier. That is what the court has observed, the Supreme Court has observed, while allowing the lady in question to go ahead with the termination of pregnancy. So let's also take a look at what the abortion laws in India actually says. Abortion is allowed until 20 weeks of pregnancy, and up to 20 to 24 weeks, in fact, the court approval is required. Abortion is subject to condition of pregnancy, and abortion is allowed if the fetus has incurable abnormality. An abortion post 24 weeks poses threat to the mother's life, and therefore that is not allowed. Now, in the context of today's judgment by the top court in a particular case, what does this mean? What kind of precedent does it set, if at all? Let me go across to my guest this evening, Karuna Nundy, advocate of the Supreme Court, joining us here on Urban Debate. Very good evening, Karuna Nundy. Thanks for joining us. I'm just simply intrigued that, there is this, and I wasn't, to be very honest, entirely aware, the fact that there can be a law that excludes unmarried women from a general rule that says anyone can abort up to 24 weeks, not unmarried women. Divorcees are allowed. But there is, as if it has something to do with marital status, which in my mind, I couldn't understand why. Yes, Ms. Nundy.
I think that's the view perhaps that the Supreme Court took as well. Your view and your instincts are in consonance, in my view, with the law and with constitutionalism. Under Article 14, you as a citizen expect to be protected on par with other women, regardless of, and I have no idea what your marital status is, because I also think it's completely irrelevant, right? Now, let's be clear that the issue here was not with a law, but with regulations, you see? Now, if the regulations are contrary to law and the 2021 amendment specifies that speaks of the word partner, for example, thereby indicating that it is not merely people with husbands who are envisaged under the law, and also the fact that they speak not merely of fetal abnormalities or difficulty to the fetus, but they also speak of harm to the woman's mental health. And the Supreme Court's view here was, the Supreme Court said that the Delhi High Court took an unduly restrictive view of the provisions of the medical termination of pregnancy rules in view of the Act amendments of 2021. And they said that the petitioner should not be denied the benefit merely because she is an unmarried woman. And what they said was that it would be against the object and spirit of the law.
Yes, because, sorry to interrupt you, but, it just completely out of common sense, if you think about it, the idea is to protect life of the fetus based on right to life. This distinction makes no sense, isn't it? Why distinguish one fetus from another basis the marital status of a mother? And of course, the whole issue of a woman's body autonomy, but the logic of it, even for the High Court to say that, this is how the law is interpreted, made no sense.
Absolutely. And I actually think that it was the opinion was a bit of a blot on the jurisprudence in this regard. And I want to read you Suchita Srivastav versus the state of Chandigarh, because I think that sets out the rights quite well. And this is a Supreme Court judgment which involved the medical termination of pregnancy, right? And it was an orphan woman living in a government-run welfare home in Chandigarh who had mental health challenges. And what the Supreme Court said was that the right to reproductive choice flows from Article 21 of the Constitution of India, right? It's the right to life. It's the right to your own body. And now, of course, depending on how the many weeks the gestation period that has elapsed, life then of the fetus, whether it becomes a child or not, is something that is regulated by legislation. But the lens that has to be taken to any rules that are made by government or to the law is a lens that's a constitutional lens. Now, what is that constitutional lens? That lens is first to see Article 21, that you have a right to life, and the nature and the scope of a woman's reproductive rights emerged from that very basic constitutional right? And yes, it may be regulated by law, but it is Article 21. It's a very high threshold that needs to be passed. And secondly, but the main argument here is one that surrounds Article 14, which is that when you speak of divorced women and when the government comes up with rules surrounding allowing divorced women and allowing widowed women to abort in particular circumstances, including when contraception fails, for example, with a partner, not a husband, but with a partner, then in such a case, is it not the case that Parliament would have intended unmarried women to be a part of that? And can you, more significantly, whether Parliament intended or not, make such a distinction between married women, unmarried women, divorced women, and widowed women? Because is there any intelligible differential? Is there any real difference between these categories that has a rational connection with the object of the legislation?
The only connection one can see clearly is the presence of a man in the woman's life. I mean, so in a way, as if the conception is predicated to the presence of a man in her life, and therefore whether she has the right to continue with her pregnancy or not. In my understanding, that's the only distinction I see, because that is the only way the marital status could come in.
It's interesting that you raise that, because I think that it's that an unmarried woman can't have a man in her life, right? Presumably because of some misplaced notion of purity. If you have been married already, and if you are divorced or if you are widowed, then it seems to be all right if you have a man in your life. Now, Yale did a study surrounding rape victims, and what they found was that if you were raped in a situation where you were in a circumstance where you were unmarried, and if you were raped, then the rapist got a very high sentence. If you had not had any demonstrable sexual intercourse in the past, if you were raped and you were married, the rapist would get a slightly lower sentence, but very clearly across the board. They looked at judgments in all the high courts and all the judgments of the Supreme Court. And if you were raped and through the two-finger test or other means, it was determined that you were unmarried and had sexual intercourse in the past, then the rapist would get a much lower sentence. So it's really tragic that in practice,
but Karuna Nundy, now, of course, there are these anomalies which you're very clearly pointing out. But I want to understand from you now what, after this particular observation of the Supreme Court, would it mean that now this sets the precedents for all future cases? Would it set a healthy precedence? Will the high courts now or other courts will have to necessarily follow this as a rule?
It's an interim order, so I do believe that for now they should certainly follow it. Once there's a final judgment, they would be bound to follow it, But even with an interim order, the Supreme Court have spoken on their interpretation of the Act and how the rules are to be read in consonance with the Act and in consonance with the Constitution. And absolutely, if the judicial discipline, in my view, would absolutely require that the high courts follow the precedent that whether it is an unmarried woman or a woman of different marital status, that you follow the same law with regard to termination of pregnancy between 20 and 24 weeks. And that a woman's mental health, of course, there would be anguish if contraception fails and she is, or there is a rape and she is forced to carry a baby to term. And not a baby at that point, if she is forced to carry a fetus to term. And frankly, would that not be injustice to the when the fetus becomes a child and the child is born? Would that not be a significant injustice? I think that,
you know, what I also found, I'm afraid I'm completely out of time, but what I found really appalling was also what the High Court said about allow the woman to stay in a confined space until such time that the childbirth happens and the child can be given for adoption. To that extent, if the law intervenes in the life of a woman and her decisions, you know, of course, this is a matter of privacy as well, isn't it? And your choices. To have to, you know, completely disclose your personal choices to that extent, doesn't that also interfere with right to privacy? That is something I want to quickly want you to comment in 10 seconds if possible before I close.
A very significant constitutional bench of the Supreme Court in Puttaswamy said that the right to privacy of the body includes the right to intimate decision-making. They cited the judgment that I spoke of, Suchita Srivastava versus Chandigarh, in that with approval, saying that reproductive choices emerge from Article 21, that the right to the body includes the right to privacy, the right to life, and if it's regulated, it must be regulated with this in mind.
Right. Thank you so much, Karuna Nundy. Pleasure always to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us. Well, that's it for now. News and updates continue here on Mirror Now. Do stay tuned. News Nation Tonight coming up next.